The Wallpaper Secret by Clara Voss. Chapter 1. The Arrival at Greystone Hollow. Rain pressed its fingers against the car windows as Evelyn Thorne drove through the mist-laced countryside, the world beyond her windshield a blur of gray trees and winding hedgerows. The wipers clicked rhythmically, but the fog was thick, so thick it seemed to have risen not from the ground, but from the memories she'd buried deep beneath her ribs. Greystone Hollow waited at the end of the lane like a question left unanswered. It had been her husband's childhood home, long abandoned, wrapped in ivy and rumor. After his passing, it arrived in her life through a dusty legal envelope, the ink on the deed barely legible beneath decades of neglect. The lawyer had cleared his throat before offering it. It appears your husband never sold it, Mrs. Thorne. It's yours now if you want it. If she hadn't wanted anything but the sound of his voice again, calm, amused, warm. The silence in their townhouse in the city had grown suffocating, the polished furniture and untouched teacups making her feel like a ghost haunting her own life. Greystone Hollow, with all its strangeness, had felt like the only place left to go. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled to a stop. The estate was larger than she'd remembered from the photograph. 3 stories of dark stone and slate, its roof slanted like folded wings. The shutters clung wearily to their hinges. Ivy gripped the structure like veins over old skin, creeping across the stone and curling near the eaves. The front door stood slightly ajar, as if the house had been holding its breath for her arrival. Evelyn stepped out, boots sinking into damp moss. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the fog hung in the trees like breath not yet exhaled. She reached the porch and pushed the door open. Inside, it smelled of forgotten wood and something faintly sweet, like pressed flowers left too long in a book. The foyer yawned out in shadows. A grand staircase curved upward in a slow spiral, its banister carved with winding leaves. A cold draft moved through the air, as if the house sighed in welcome or warning. She dropped her keys in a porcelain bowl on a narrow table by the door, the sound startling in the quiet. Then she simply stood, her suitcase still in hand, looking at the shape of her own loneliness cast against the hallway's faded wallpaper. That wallpaper, pale green with an old-fashioned fleur-de-lis pattern, it clung in patches and peeled in others, like skin shedding after a burn. Some places bubbled and curled from moisture. Others revealed a second layer beneath, fainter, older. Evelyn stepped closer and reached out, running her fingertips along the curling edge of one strip. A whisper stirred. It was so soft she might have imagined it. A breath caught between the layers of paint and plaster. Evelyn. Her name. Just once. Just barely. She turned abruptly, heart lurching. No one there. Only her own reflection staring back from a tarnished mirror on the opposite wall. She let out a breath and laughed, too sharp, too brittle. Grief played cruel tricks. The mind was desperate for presence when absence was all that remained. She shook off the moment and explored the house room by room, each one a relic. The library still held rows of books, their spines faded and spackled with dust. The parlor's furniture wore white sheets like shrouds. In the kitchen, the windows were clouded over, and the air smelled of ash and cinnamon, though no one had lit the stove in years. By twilight, Evelyn had unpacked the bare essentials and settled into the master bedroom on the second floor. It was the only room that felt remotely alive. The wallpaper here was different, deep maroon, gilded with the pattern of climbing roses. It was untouched, whole, yet something about it made her uneasy. She lay in bed with the lamp on, shadows gathering thick around the corners of the room. The rain had returned, a soft pattering on the roof like fingers tapping out secrets. Sleep did not come easily. Somewhere near midnight, a faint rustle stirred her, a sound like paper tearing slowly. Evelyn sat up, the sheets twisted around her legs. It was coming from the hallway. She opened the door and stepped out. The corridor was dim, the only light spilling from a narrow window at the far end. The house creaked softly, as if shifting in its sleep. The sound came again, not quite tearing, more like whispering. Drawn toward it, Evelyn walked past the faded portraits and antique sconces until she reached the far end of the hall. There, on the west-facing wall, the wallpaper had peeled back further than before. Her eyes followed a curl of green and gold that exposed the lath and plaster beneath. The whisper was louder here, almost a hum now, and strangely rhythmic, as though someone were murmuring words just beyond the veil of the wall. She leaned in. A phrase surfaced, soft as a sigh. "I never meant for you to find it." Her breath caught in her throat. She staggered back, heart pounding. Her eyes scanned the hallway. No one. No sound now. Only the thump of her heartbeat and the rain outside. Had she truly heard it? Or had she, like so many who'd lost someone, imagined the voice of the dead in the wind? But it had sounded like him. Like Graham. The words lingered, echoing in the airless silence. "I never meant for you to find it." Find what? Evelyn stood frozen, one hand against the wall, the paper flaking beneath her touch. In the hollow hush of the old house, the wallpaper stirred again, only slightly, only for a breath. But enough. Enough to know that something was there. Watching, waiting, and whispering things only the dead should know. Chapter 2. What the House Remembers. Morning came grudgingly to Greystone Hollow. The fog hadn't lifted, it merely rearranged itself, hovering close to the windows like a visitor too polite to knock. Evelyn awoke with the faint memory of voices in her ears, but when she turned to look at the wall, it was still, quiet, and whole again. The peeling wallpaper at the far end of the corridor was just that, peeling wallpaper. Nothing more. Or so she tried to believe. She dressed slowly, a thick wool sweater layered over her nightclothes. The floors creaked under her feet as she padded down the stairs, each groan of the wood a tired complaint. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove, fingers trembling just slightly. Whether from the chill or the memory of last night, she wasn't sure. The whisper had been too clear, not imagined, not dreamed. It had been Graham's voice. She knew it as surely as she knew the smell of his cologne or the way his eyes creased when he smiled. He had said those words, "I never meant for you to find it." But what was it? The kettle began to hum, and Evelyn turned away from the window, pouring the water over a waiting tea bag in a chipped mug she'd found in a dusty cupboard. As the tea steeped, she let her eyes wander back to the hall. Something about the house made it feel awake. Not in the way all old houses creaked and sighed, but in a way that felt personal, intimate, observant. When she was younger, she might have called it haunted. But this was not a ghost that dragged chains or moved furniture. It was quieter, more intentional. Tea in hand, she returned to the corridor upstairs, where the wallpaper had spoken. In the gray light, it appeared less sinister, though no less curious. The peeling section looked untouched now. But when she pressed her hand to the wall, she could feel something beneath, like a thin seam in the plaster, subtle but there. A line. She traced it with her fingers. It ran from the baseboard to nearly shoulder height, just enough to suggest that something had been covered up. A door, perhaps, or a panel. Her breath caught as the thought took root. Could there be a hidden compartment, something buried within the wall? The idea settled into her bones, both thrilling and cold. She returned to the kitchen, rummaged through drawers until she found a rusty old screwdriver and brought it back upstairs. With care, she pried gently at the edges of the wallpaper. The paper flaked away in damp strips, revealing more of the faded plaster beneath. And then, a soft click. A section of the wall gave way, barely an inch, enough for her to curl her fingers into the gap and pull. Dust rained down. Behind the plaster was a narrow recess in the wall, no more than 2 feet wide and maybe 4 feet tall. Inside sat a small wooden box, its surface blackened with age, a brass clasp holding it shut. No lock. Evelyn stared. She reached out, half expecting the box to be cold. It was warm. Breathing shallow, she opened it. Inside, letters, dozens of them, tied together with twine. They were addressed not to her, but to him. To Graham. But not from her. One by one, her hands trembling, Evelyn unfolded the aged paper. The ink was faded, but legible, each letter written in a looping, elegant hand. The name signed at the bottom of the first letter made her pause. Yours eternally, M. M? She flipped to the next, then the next. Each letter dated, each from the same woman, Mira. The letters were intimate, loving, familiar. They spoke of secrets and longing, of promises made beneath moonlight and behind locked doors. One letter mentioned Greystone Hollow, another mentioned her. She suspects nothing yet, it read, but I fear this house remembers more than we wish it to. I hear it sometimes, like a heartbeat beneath the floorboards. Evelyn closed the box. The room felt colder, or perhaps it was her blood that had gone cold. Who was Mira? And what had Graham kept from her? That evening, Evelyn sat in the library, the letters spread across the desk in a fan of parchment and ink. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, and though it gave little warmth, it provided light and comfort. She read them all, one by one. Each revealed a layer of a relationship she had never known existed. Myra's words painted a portrait of a woman both poetic and tormented. She spoke of secrets they must keep, not just from Evelyn, but from others. Greystone is listening again. Mira wrote in one letter dated 9 years prior. I heard footsteps last night, though no one was there. The wallpaper shifted. I swear it did. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the wall behind her. A single strip had begun to curl at the corner. She rose slowly, crossing the room. The wallpaper, once flush, now bore the same subtle lines she'd found upstairs. Another seam. Another secret. With a dry tongue pressed to the roof of her mouth, she lifted the corner. A whisper curled from beneath the paper, almost like a sigh. Not here. Not yet. She dropped the flap, heart racing. The fire sputtered behind her. What was happening in this house? What had happened? She took the box of letters and climbed the stairs, back to her room. The maroon wallpaper with its climbing roses loomed above her bed like a watchful eye. She placed the letters in the bedside drawer and closed it gently. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the darkened hall. Somewhere beyond the curve of the corridor, the house exhaled. She didn't know yet who Mira was. She didn't know what Graham had kept from her. But she knew this. Greystone Hollow was not just a house. It was a witness. And perhaps if she stayed long enough, it would tell her everything. Chapter 3. The Memory Beneath the Paper. The days blurred together in Greystone Hollow, each one folding into the next like the layers of old wallpaper in the house. The fog never quite left. It lingered at the edges of her world, curling through the trees and seeping into the cracks in the stone. Evelyn spent her hours sifting through the letters, one by one, feeling as if each one weighed her down more than the last. The words, the tone, the familiarity with which Mira had written. How could Graham have kept this from her? It wasn't the affair that troubled her most, though. It wasn't even the depth of the secrecy. It was the house itself. Greystone Hollow had been abandoned for years, decades even, yet it hummed with a kind of quiet life. When Evelyn walked the halls, she swore she could feel the walls watching her, listening to her. Every shadow stretched longer than it should, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo her thoughts. And it was always the wallpaper. No matter where she went, it seemed to pull at her attention. That faded green and gold pattern in the hallway, the maroon roses in her room, and now, on the second floor, another strange section had begun to peel away, revealing more of the same pale plaster beneath. Each new strip she pulled back felt like another layer of a secret she had yet to uncover. It was the third day when she found the door. It was hidden behind a section of the maroon wallpaper, tucked into the corner of the room, where the wall met the farthest window. She had almost missed it, a narrow, faint line along the edge of the wall where the paper had begun to fray. But as her fingers brushed over it, she felt the coolness of metal beneath her touch. At first, she thought it was simply another crack, another forgotten seam in the house's age-worn skin. But when she pressed harder, there was a faint click, and the wall gave way. Slowly, gently, as if it had been waiting for her. A door, no larger than a cupboard, swung open. Inside was nothing but dust and shadow. No light reached into the small space, but Evelyn could feel something beyond it, a presence, an absence. Without thinking, she stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a soft thud, and the air in the small room shifted. She couldn't explain why, but it felt as though the house had sealed her in, like it wanted her to stay. The room was small, as though it had once been a closet or storage space. The air smelled of mildew, thick and stagnant. Cobwebs draped the corners, and dust covered the floor in a thick layer. But in the center of the room, there was a strange object draped in a faded cloth. Evelyn's heart raced as she approached. When she pulled back the cloth, her breath hitched in her chest. It was a mirror, a large, oval mirror with an ornate, tarnished silver frame, its surface streaked with age. But it wasn't just any mirror. It was the mirror from the portrait in the hallway. The portrait of Graham. Her husband's image had always haunted her, but seeing it reflected in the tarnished glass brought something new. A sense of dread, something she couldn't explain, fluttered in her chest. She stared into the mirror. Her own reflection blinked back at her, pale and distant. But something was off. The image was wrong. She stepped closer. Her reflection was there, but it was no longer her own face that looked back at her. Instead, the face of a woman, Mira, appeared. Her dark eyes wide with fear, her hands pressed against the frame, as though she were trapped inside. Evelyn staggered back, breathless, as the room spun. She reached out to steady herself against the wall, but when she looked back into the mirror, it was gone. There was only her reflection again, still and calm. But the image of Mira lingered in the back of her mind. She could not breathe. This house, this place, was hiding more than just secrets. It was alive with them. Evelyn took a step backward, her chest tightening. She forced herself to turn away, her feet dragging against the floor as she made her way back to the door. The latch clicked open, but as she stepped into the hallway, something caught her eye. The wallpaper. It was peeling again, this time more quickly. The edges had begun to lift, as if something was pushing from behind. Slowly, deliberately, the pattern on the paper shifted, moved, as if it were alive. Evelyn's heart pounded as the words began to appear. "You have to leave, Evelyn." She froze, staring at the fresh words carved into the paper, each letter dark and smeared, like something had written it with the blood of a shadow. "You have to leave now." Her throat tightened. The house had been watching her, waiting for her to uncover its secret. But what was the secret? What had Graham hidden from her in this cursed place? The door to the master bedroom slammed open, though there was no wind to speak of. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stepped back, but there was nothing. The room stood still. No voices, no whispers, just the thick silence of the house. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to calm down. The mirror, the whispering wallpaper, the letters from Mira, they all pointed to something deeper, something she couldn't yet see. As the darkness of the night crept into the corners of the house, Evelyn knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She had to find out what was hidden in the walls, in the shadows, in the silence of Greystone Hollow. The house wanted her to find it. But what if it didn't want her to leave? Chapter 4. The Door That Should Not Be Opened. The night hung thick with silence, the kind that made every breath sound too loud, every movement too deliberate. Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind swimming with fragments of the day, fragments she could not piece together. The mirror, the whispering wallpaper, the letters. Each seemed like an isolated puzzle piece, and yet, when she tried to fit them together, nothing made sense. She had tried to sleep, to shut her eyes and pretend the house had no power over her, that the shadows were nothing but the normal dark of night. But it didn't work. There was something deeply unsettling in the way the house breathed around her, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting for her to wake. A soft thud sounded from somewhere below. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Evelyn sat up, heart pounding. There it was again, the distinct sound of movement in the house. She told herself it was just the house settling, the familiar groans and sighs of old wood and tired walls. But she knew deep down that something had changed. This house, which had been silent for so long, was no longer just settling. It was waking up. She stood slowly, careful not to make a sound, and moved to the window. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light over the lawn. The fog, thick and heavy, seemed to swirl closer to the house, almost as if it were drawn in by some unseen force. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something. At the far end of the garden, beyond the overgrown hedges, there was a faint glow, a light that had not been there earlier. She hesitated for only a moment before grabbing her sweater and pulling it on. The chill of the night air wrapped around her as she stepped into the hallway. The house felt colder now, colder than it had before, and the whispering, it was louder tonight. "Come closer, Evelyn." The voice seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the house were trying to coax her into the dark, coax her into the unknown. She moved toward the stairs, the old wood creaking under her feet with every step. As she descended into the dimly lit hallway, her eyes flicked toward the master bedroom door. It was ajar. The faintest glimmer of light bled out from within. The house, it was alive. It wanted her to see something. It wanted her to open the door. Evelyn stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, torn between the growing sense of dread and the overwhelming pull to know the truth. Was this the house itself speaking to her? Or was it someone more sinister? A distant thud echoed from upstairs. No, not upstairs. It was coming from below. Without thinking, she crossed the floor, her steps muffled by the thick carpet. She moved toward the entrance to the basement, the door half concealed by shadows. The handle was cold, slick under her fingers, but it turned easily. Evelyn stepped inside. The air grew colder as she descended the narrow staircase. The dampness of the basement hit her immediately, and the smell of mildew and earth filled her nose. There was no light down here, only the faint glow from the moon filtering through the small, grimy windows. Breath fogged in front of her as she moved through the basement, her footsteps heavy against the concrete floor. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the weight of the silence pressed down on her chest, making each breath harder to take. In the far corner of the basement, she spotted a small table. On it sat an old lamp, its light flickering weakly as if it, too, was struggling to stay lit. Evelyn moved toward it, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up as she felt the air grow thicker with every step. On the table, beneath the lamp, was a small wooden box. It was the same size and shape as the one she had found in the secret room earlier, but this one looked older. The wood was darker, worn from years of neglect. A brass clasp held it shut, the metal tarnished from age. But unlike the other box, this one felt wrong. There was something dark about it, something foreboding. Evelyn reached for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal clasp. The box opened with a soft click. Inside was a stack of papers, neatly folded, their edges yellowed with time. She pulled them free and began to read. The first page was a letter, dated 20 years ago. The handwriting was sharp and angular, its tone cold, almost distant. It was addressed to someone named Graham. The house knows. It listens. It remembers everything. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she read the next line. The wallpaper, it is more than just decoration. It is a barrier, a threshold between the living and the dead. And I fear what happens if you cross it. The words blurred before her eyes, and a cold shiver ran through her spine. She flipped to the next page. The letters grew darker. I cannot stay here anymore. It is no longer safe. Do not open the door, Graham. It will take us all. And then another name. Mira. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Mira, the woman from the letters, the one who had written to Graham. She dropped the paper as if it had burned her fingers. The basement felt colder now, impossibly so. Her pulse quickened, and she turned quickly, eyes wide with fear, scanning the shadows around her. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open. She froze. A shadow moved at the top of the stairs, slow, deliberate. Evelyn's pulse raced as she turned toward the lamp, her hand shaking as she reached for the switch. The light flickered once more before sputtering out entirely, plunging her into darkness. From the top of the stairs came a voice, a whisper. You should not have come here, Evelyn. Her blood ran cold. Leave, before it's too late. The voice, it wasn't Mira. It wasn't Graham. It was something else. With a trembling hand, Evelyn backed toward the stairs, the dark pressing in on her from all sides. She could hear the slow, steady creak of the floorboards above her. Someone was up there. Someone who had been waiting for her. And now they were coming. Chapter 5, The Eyes Beneath the Surface. Evelyn's breath hitched as she backed toward the stairs, her pulse quickening with each creak that echoed from above. The darkness around her seemed to press in, thick and suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Her heart hammered against her chest, and the voice from the darkness, still echoed in her mind. Leave, before it's too late. She spun, reaching for the stairwell, but the darkness pressed against her like a physical force, halting her steps. The light had gone out, and the weight of the basement was too much to bear. Something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her bones, a creeping sensation of dread she could no longer ignore. Her fingers trembled as they gripped the railing. Slowly she ascended, the cold stone beneath her feet slipping with every step. The air felt thinner, as if the very house was constricting her, pulling her in with invisible hands. She could still hear the faintest whisper from below, just beyond the reach of her hearing. And then silence. Evelyn paused, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. The silence wasn't reassuring. It was suffocating, as if the house itself was waiting, holding its breath for her next move. She reached the top of the stairs, and her eyes flicked toward the master bedroom door. It was wide open now. A cold chill spread through her, the kind that cut through the skin and sank into the marrow. She knew, somehow, she was no longer alone. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to move forward, her feet pulling her unwillingly toward the room. Each step felt like a slow march toward her doom, the house watching her, listening to her every movement. Inside the room, the air was thick with a damp heaviness, as if the very walls had absorbed years of grief and secrets. The bed, once neat, now lay disturbed, an old comforter twisted and askew as though someone had recently risen from it. The curtains fluttered gently in the breeze, but there was no breeze to speak of. And yet, the faintest whisper of a voice came again, closer this time. Evelyn. Her name. A soft sigh, almost tender. She turned, feeling the weight of something unseen, pressing her toward the corner of the room. The faint glimmer of light from the moon crept through the window, illuminating something odd on the floor near the bed. Something small, but unmistakably out of place. Evelyn's breath caught as she crouched down. A photograph. She picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing the edges of the worn paper. The photograph was faded, but the image was clear enough. It showed Graham standing in front of a large mansion, Greystone Hollow, before it had been abandoned. He was young in the picture, smiling in the way she remembered him when they had first met, his eyes full of warmth, no hint of the secrets he would hide from her. But there was someone else in the picture. A woman, Mira. She could tell by the way she stood so close to Graham, her hand lightly resting on his arm. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, her features partially hidden by the soft glow of the light behind her. Her eyes, though, those eyes, they were unmistakable. The same haunting look that Evelyn had glimpsed in the mirror, the same fear, the same desperation. Suddenly the house groaned, as though something were shifting within its very foundations. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She set the photograph down on the nightstand and glanced around the room. The whispers were louder now, drifting through the air like soft echoes. You don't understand, Evelyn. The voice was closer, but this time it wasn't coming from the shadows, it was coming from within the walls. She could feel it vibrating through the very stones of the room, felt it in the air around her. Her breath caught as she turned toward the far corner of the room. The wallpaper, that wallpaper, was peeling once more, faster now, as though it were being torn away by an unseen hand. The symbols began to emerge, strange, angular shapes that resembled nothing Evelyn had ever seen before. A pattern, like an ancient language, forming from the torn remnants of the paper. The shapes twisted and stretched, as if the walls themselves were trying to speak. The air grew colder still, and her breath fogged in front of her. Graham knew. The voice was clearer now, and Evelyn felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, a lingering memory that had never quite left. The house had kept it. The house had kept all of them, Graham, Mira, and the secrets they had hidden. Graham knew it was too late. A sudden, sharp noise made Evelyn spin around. Something had fallen from the table near the door, a small object clattering to the ground. Her hand instinctively reached for the lamp beside the bed, but the light was gone, leaving only shadows. She stepped closer to the fallen object, crouching down to pick it up. It was a key, a small brass key, old and tarnished with age. It was intricately carved, but there was nothing distinguishing about it, nothing that stood out as particularly important. Yet Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had never seen it before, but something deep inside her told her it was crucial. It belonged to something she had yet to find. The door, the voice whispered again, faint but urgent. The door you must not open. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the key. A sudden impulse washed over her, a need to understand, to uncover the final secret that had eluded her for so long. The house had been hiding it, keeping it locked away, but now, with this key in her hand, she had the means to open it. The whispers continued, now louder, growing more frantic. Leave before it consumes you. But Evelyn could not, would not, turn away. She could feel it, the pull of the house, drawing her closer to something hidden, something dark and terrible beneath the surface. The secrets of Greystone Hollow were finally within her reach. And she would find them. Chapter 6, Beneath the Layers. Evelyn stood frozen, her fingers still wrapped around the cold brass key. The air around her was thick with whispers, but they were no longer the soft, almost tender tones from before. Now they were frantic, desperate, as if the house itself was trying to warn her away from something it had kept hidden for far too long. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, her breath shallow. Every inch of her body was telling her to run, to escape the suffocating weight of the house and the ominous presence that clung to its walls. But the key in her hand pulsed with an undeniable force, like an invitation she couldn't refuse. The voice, once soft, now rasped through the air. You shouldn't be here. Evelyn, you must leave. But it wasn't just the voice that unnerved her. It was the way the wallpaper seemed to shift, its peeling edges trembling as though alive. The symbols she had seen before, those strange, angular shapes, were now clearer, more defined, as if they were reaching out to her. The air was colder than ever, and her breath fogged in front of her. The key felt heavier, the weight of it pressing against her palm, urging her toward something she could barely comprehend. She looked toward the door, the one that led deeper into the house, beyond the room where she had already uncovered so many secrets. The voice came again, low and urgent, almost pleading. Do not open it. Do not let it out. Her pulse quickened. She knew the voice was warning her about something, about the door that lay beyond. But what was behind it? What was hidden in this house that could cause such fear, such desperation in the air itself? Without thinking, her legs moved toward the door, the key seeming to guide her. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. The house had chosen her, and she would not leave without the answers she so desperately sought. The door loomed before her, its wood dark and warped with age. She could feel the energy radiating from it, a strange and malevolent presence that made her skin crawl. The key fit perfectly into the old lock, its teeth clicking into place with an unsettling ease. As she turned the key, the house seemed to exhale a long, groaning sigh that rattled through the floorboards. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow hallway that led deeper into the bowels of the estate. The walls here were darker, more worn, as though this part of the house had been forgotten, left to rot in the shadows. The floor was covered in dust, the remnants of old furniture scattered along the walls like forgotten relics. But it wasn't the room that held her attention, it was the thick, oppressive darkness that seemed to grow in the very air, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for her. Evelyn stepped forward, her footsteps muffled by the dust. She reached out, her fingers brushing the wall for guidance, and felt a cold, damp sensation seep through the fabric of her glove. She shivered, pulling her hand back quickly, but the chill remained, sinking into her bones. The hallway stretched before her, endless and suffocating. Every step seemed to carry her deeper into the house's twisted heart, a place where time itself felt distorted, as though the past and present had bled together, leaving a stain on everything. At the end of the hallway, there was another door. Smaller, more delicate than the others, but it held an undeniable sense of finality. It was the door she had been drawn to, the one she had unknowingly sought since the moment she had arrived at Greystone Hollow. Her pulse raced as she approached it. The air around her seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping even further. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the house growing tighter, pressing her into this final confrontation. With trembling hands, Evelyn reached for the doorknob. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the sound deafening in the silence. Slowly, she turned it, the mechanism clicking as the door creaked open. What she saw beyond the door made her blood run cold. The room was small, no larger than a closet, but it was filled with strange objects, faded photographs, torn letters, and jars filled with dark liquid. The walls were covered in the same peeling wallpaper, but here the symbols were more intricate, more elaborate. The shapes seemed to move, twisting and turning as though alive. And in the center of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror. Evelyn's gaze was drawn to it, as if something were calling her from within its depths. She took a step forward, her feet carrying her without thought until she stood before the mirror. At first, she saw nothing, just her reflection, pale, weary, and unsure. But then it moved. Her reflection was different. Her own eyes were wide with terror, her face contorted in a silent scream. And then the image of her reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate twist of the mouth that was not her own. Evelyn stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The reflection remained, its eyes fixed on her, its smile widening with each passing second. "You've come too far." The voice was soft, but it echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like a whisper from another world. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but her feet wouldn't move. The mirror was pulling her in, drawing her closer to whatever secret it held. And then the whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "You're not alone." The room seemed to pulse with dark energy, the walls trembling as though something was waking up, something that had been trapped here for far too long. Evelyn felt her knees buckle beneath her, but before she could fall, the mirror's surface rippled, as though it were liquid. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, the figure in the reflection. A woman, dark-haired, with a face she knew too well. Mira. The smile on her reflection twisted into something darker, something cruel. Evelyn gasped, stepping back, but her reflection reached out, a hand emerging from the glass, as if it were trying to pull her in. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered. "You should have listened." And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the hand vanished, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the cold, empty room. The mirror was still, its surface smooth and lifeless once more. But Evelyn knew deep in her heart that she had not imagined it. Mira had been there, and whatever secret lay hidden in the walls of Greystone Hollow was closer than ever. She had to know the truth. She had to uncover it, no matter the cost. Chapter 7: The Warnings. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she stepped back from the mirror. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder that something ancient and restless had awakened within these walls. The air around her was thick with an almost oppressive silence, the kind that pressed in on the senses and made it difficult to breathe. She could still feel the weight of the reflection's gaze, its smile, as though it were waiting for her to make the next move. But she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, the chill of the room sinking deeper into her bones. "You're not alone." The words echoed in her mind, a chilling refrain she couldn't shake. She had been alone, hadn't she? She had come to this place alone, hoping that solitude would allow her to grieve, to heal. But now it seemed as though the house had other plans for her. She had come looking for answers, and in doing so, she had uncovered something far darker than she had anticipated. She looked back toward the mirror, half expecting to see the reflection of Mira again. But there was only the glass, smooth and undisturbed, as if the moment had never happened. Yet Evelyn knew that whatever she had witnessed was real. The reflection, Mira, had been there. And somehow it had known her name. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she turned away from the mirror, forcing herself to look at the room around her. The strange jars, the photographs, the torn letters, all of it seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. She couldn't tell if the house itself was alive with secrets, or if it was simply a vessel for something far older, something that had been buried beneath the layers of time and dust. As she moved toward the door, the coldness in the room seemed to follow her, wrapping around her like a shroud. The whispers were back, this time louder, more insistent. She could no longer make out the words, but the sense of urgency was undeniable. The house was speaking to her, begging her to understand, to uncover the truth that had been hidden here for so long. She stopped in the doorway, her hand hovering over the handle. A faint sound drifted through the house, footsteps, slow and deliberate. Someone or something was moving through the halls, approaching her. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard anyone arrive. There were no cars in the driveway, no visitors. The only person who had been in the house with her was, well, no one, really. She had been alone, hadn't she? The footsteps grew louder, closer. Panic surged in her veins. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to face whatever was coming. But the sound of those steps was inescapable, like a slow drumbeat that matched the rhythm of her own pulse. Thud, thud, thud. Evelyn's heart raced, her thoughts scattering in all directions. She wanted to run. She wanted to flee this place and never look back. But her feet felt heavy, rooted to the floor as if the house itself was holding her captive. She closed her eyes, willing the noise to stop, willing the footsteps to fade into nothing. Thud! A soft sigh escaped her lips, and for a brief moment the sound seemed to vanish. She dared to open her eyes. And there, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was an outline, a shadow cast against the pale light filtering through the room, a shape that seemed to pulse with darkness. At first, Evelyn thought it was a trick of the light, a mirage born from her fraying nerves. But the longer she stared, the more real it became. The shadow was humanoid, tall and thin, its features indistinguishable, as though it were made of smoke, a formless figure trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. Its presence was suffocating, as though it drew the very life from the air around it. Evelyn stepped backward, her heart thundering in her chest. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching her. Its form seemed to shift in and out of focus, flickering like a broken memory. She could feel its gaze upon her, though she could not see its eyes. It was as though it had no face, no identity, just an empty space where a person should be. And then, in a voice so faint it could have been a whisper from the wind, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were cold, detached, as though spoken by someone who had long since given up on understanding the consequences of their actions. Evelyn's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to ask who or what it was, but her voice wouldn't come. She was paralyzed by the weight of the moment, caught between fear and curiosity. The shadow took a step forward. "It knows you," it said, its voice reverberating in the air. "The house. It knows you, Evelyn." She didn't know how it knew her name, but somehow she knew that it was telling the truth. The house did know her. It knew everything. The memories, the pain, the guilt that had followed her here like an unwelcome shadow. It was all tied to this place, to the wallpaper, to the secrets that had been buried beneath the layers of time. The shadow moved again, this time closer, until it was standing right in front of her. It reached out a hand. No, not a hand. A shadow, a tendril of darkness that seemed to bend and stretch impossibly, as if it could never fully take form. It brushed lightly against her skin, and Evelyn shivered. "You don't belong here," it murmured. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissipated, vanishing into the air like smoke, leaving only a lingering coldness behind. The room felt emptier now, devoid of the oppressive presence that had filled it moments before. But Evelyn knew deep down that it was still there, lurking, waiting. She was not alone. She hadn't been alone for a long time. The whispers returned, softer now, like a distant murmur, but they were no longer warnings. They were inviting her. They were calling her deeper into the heart of the house, beckoning her to unravel the truth, no matter the cost. And Evelyn knew with chilling certainty that she had no choice but to follow. Chapter 8. Beneath the Surface. Evelyn stood frozen, her breath shallow, as the last tendrils of the shadow disappeared into the air. The room, once filled with oppressive weight, now felt suffocating in its silence. The whispering had stopped, but the echo of its message lingered in the air. She could almost hear it still, the last remnants of its chilling words, etched in the hollow corners of her mind. "You don't belong here." She took a slow, hesitant step forward, then another. Her legs felt weak beneath her, as though the ground itself were shifting beneath her feet. The house had never felt this alive before, this aware. It was as though the walls, the air, and even the very floorboards were watching her every move. She had to keep moving. She couldn't stay in this room, trapped by her fear, by the unnerving presence that had just confronted her. Evelyn made her way down the hallway, her footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the vast silence. The house was too quiet, too still. The air was heavy with something unspoken, something waiting just beneath the surface. When she reached the staircase, she hesitated. A part of her told her to leave the house behind, to walk away and never return. But the other part of her, the part that had already uncovered so many of its secrets, could not stop herself. There was something here, something buried deep within the house, and she could feel it pulling at her, tugging her toward the truth. She placed her hand on the banister and began to ascend, the wood creaking under her weight. The steps seemed to groan in protest, as if the house itself were reluctant to allow her further into its depths. As she reached the top, her gaze flickered to the door at the far end of the hallway, the door she had never dared to open. The door to her husband's study. Her pulse quickened at the thought of it. That room had always been locked, always off limits, even when he was alive. She had never asked him why. But now, standing in the dim light of the upstairs hallway, Evelyn knew she had no choice. She had to know what secrets it held. She had to know what her husband had kept hidden in that room, what had driven him to speak those last words, to speak to her from beyond the grave. She walked toward the door, her heart thumping in her chest. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, the silence more oppressive. She reached the door and placed her hand on the cold, tarnished handle. It turned easily in her grip, as though the house had been waiting for her to open it all along. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a room that was shrouded in dust and shadow. The air inside felt thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Evelyn's eyes swept across the room, taking in the faded wallpaper, the worn leather chair by the desk, the heavy drapes that blocked out any hint of light. It was a room frozen in time, a room that had not changed since the last time her husband had been here. The walls seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with their silence. But there was something else, something beneath the surface, something that was just out of reach. She stepped into the room, her shoes clicking softly on the wooden floor. The dust stirred around her with every movement, and the smell of stale air hung heavy in her nostrils. She walked to the desk and ran her fingers over the surface. The wood was smooth, but there was something about it, something familiar. She glanced down at the papers scattered across the desk, most of them yellowed with age, their edges curled and frayed. Evelyn picked up one of the papers, unfolding it carefully. It was a letter, its ink faded with time. She squinted at the words, trying to make sense of the delicate script. My love, forgive me for what I have done. There are things that cannot be undone, things that must remain hidden. The house, it speaks, Evelyn. You must never listen to it. It knows too much, and it will never let you leave. Her breath caught in her throat. The letter was from her husband. It was written in his handwriting, yet it made no sense. He had never spoken of the house in such a way. He had never warned her of anything like this. What had he meant? And why had he hidden it here, in this room, for her to find? Suddenly, a faint scratching sound reached her ears. At first, it was barely perceptible, like the scurrying of an insect or the whisper of a breeze. But it grew louder, more distinct, until it was undeniable. It was coming from the wall behind her. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, and she spun around, her eyes wide with panic. The scratching continued, frantic now, as though something or someone was trying to break through from the other side. Scritch, scritch, scritch. The sound was maddening, a jagged rhythm that clawed at her nerves. She stepped back, her hand instinctively reaching for the desk, her fingers brushing against the cold surface of the wood. She felt a coldness seep into her bones, a chill that seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. The scratching stopped, and then from the silence came a voice. A whisper. You shouldn't have come. It was her husband's voice. Evelyn froze. Her pulse thundered in her ears. It couldn't be him. It couldn't be. She turned toward the wall, her eyes scanning for the source of the voice. The wallpaper, the same faded pattern that adorned every room in the house, seemed to ripple before her eyes, as though something was moving just beneath its surface. She reached out, trembling, and placed her hand against the wall. The moment her skin touched the paper, the room seemed to shudder, and a sudden gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the dim light that had been filtering through the curtains. Darkness enveloped her. You shouldn't have come, the voice repeated, louder this time, as the walls seemed to close in around her. Evelyn stumbled backward, her mind spinning. The house. It was alive, and it was watching her. It knew her name, knew her every move, and now it was trying to keep her here, trapped. The walls groaned in protest, the scratching starting again, louder and more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The house was silent once more. But Evelyn knew, without a doubt, that whatever was beneath the surface, whatever was hidden within these walls, was far from done with her. It was only just beginning. Chapter 9. The Thin Veil. Evelyn awoke to an unearthly silence, the kind of silence that presses on your chest, making it harder to breathe. She lay still for a moment, her eyes wide open, but staring into the dark. Her pulse was erratic, as though the night had shaken her to the core, and her mind, still tangled in confusion, struggled to make sense of what had happened in the study. The whispers, the voice, the feeling of being watched. She reached out and touched the cold wood of the nightstand, grounding herself in the familiar. The room around her was still, but something was wrong, something she couldn't place. Her breath hitched as she finally pushed herself upright, her eyes scanning the room, the corners, as if waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. The house felt different now. It felt closer, as though the very air around her had thickened. She had always known there was something about this place, something wrong. But now, after the night in the study, she understood it more fully. It was the house itself. It was the walls, the floors, the very bones of this place. Everything here seemed to have a mind of its own, a presence that stretched far beyond the mortal world. Evelyn shook off the rising panic. She had to keep moving. She had to push forward and find out the truth. After a long moment, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, the cold floorboards sending a shiver up her spine. She wrapped her arms around her shoulders, as if trying to shield herself from the chilling embrace of the house. The room around her, though dimly lit by the pale light creeping through the curtains, felt heavier now. Every crack in the walls, every groan of the wood seemed to whisper. It was as if the house had woken up. She walked slowly toward the door, her feet tentative, as though she expected the floorboards to betray her at any moment. There was an undeniable urgency in her steps, but also a sense of dread, a feeling that she was nearing a precipice she could not turn back from. The study was calling her again. She could feel it in her bones. When she reached the staircase, she paused. The air felt oppressive here, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting. She knew what she had to do. She had to confront it. Whatever was beneath the wallpaper, beneath the floorboards, beneath the house itself, it had to be revealed. Evelyn descended the stairs, her heart thudding in her chest with each step, but as she reached the hallway, a strange sound stopped her in her tracks. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, a soft tapping, almost like fingers drumming lightly on the walls. She pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. It came again, closer now. Evelyn's breath hitched. She moved toward the source, drawn by the sound, her curiosity battling with the rising tide of fear. The tapping was coming from behind the wall, the same wall in the study where she had heard the whispers, where she had felt her husband's presence. She rushed to the study, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. It swung open easily, as though the house had been waiting for her. Inside, the room was just as she had left it, save for one thing, the wallpaper. It was no longer still. The once faint pattern now seemed to shift, to writhe under her gaze. The colors were darker, more pronounced, as though something was trying to break through, pushing against the surface. Her breath quickened. She approached the wall cautiously, her fingers brushing the surface of the wallpaper. It felt cold, unnaturally so, like a frozen surface. But as her skin made contact, the tapping sound grew louder, more frantic, almost desperate. The wall before her seemed to ripple, the pattern shifting in waves, and suddenly a shadow, no larger than a hand, seemed to move beneath the surface. Evelyn stepped back, her heart pounding. The shape was unmistakable. It was a hand, thin and spindly, the fingers long and bent at odd angles. The hand slammed against the wall, and Evelyn stumbled backward, a scream building in her throat. The sound was deafening now, the scratching, the thumping, the desperate banging from the other side. It wasn't just a wall anymore. It was a prison. It was alive. Evelyn's mind raced as she scrambled to find a way to break through. She ran her fingers along the edge of the wallpaper, searching for any weakness, any sign that this cursed wall might yield to her. There was a loose corner, frayed from age. She tore at it, her hand shaking violently as she pulled the paper back. Behind the wallpaper there was another layer, old wood, rotted with time, and hidden beneath it, a crack. A narrow crack, too small for her to see through, but wide enough to send a shudder down her spine. She pressed her ear to the crack, the scratching now a steady, rhythmic sound. It was coming from inside the wall, from somewhere deep beneath the house. The tapping stopped suddenly, and Evelyn held her breath, listening. Then, from the dark crevice, a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered to her. "Do you want to know?" Her heart lurched in her chest. It was him, her husband. The voice was familiar, but distant. It sounded so far away, as though it had traveled from another time, another space. Her husband's voice, tinged with desperation, drifted into the room. "Evelyn, you don't understand. The house, it's not just a house. It's alive, and it won't let you go. It never lets anyone go." The walls groaned, the house seeming to exhale a low, mournful sound, as if the very foundations were coming to life. Evelyn's pulse raced. The crack widened slightly as she dug her fingers into the seam, pulling harder, desperate to break through. She had to understand. She had to know what was hidden here, what her husband had uncovered before it was too late. The whispering began again, louder now, almost deafening, and Evelyn's head swam with dizziness. Her vision blurred as a force, unseen but powerful, gripped her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. And then, as though something shifted in the air itself, the house answered. The wall before her split open, a jagged crack that revealed the space beyond, a hollow void that seemed to stretch into infinity. A cold wind rushed out, bringing with it a bitter, decaying stench, the smell of rot and forgotten things. Her hands were frozen to the wall as though they were bound by invisible chains. The voice came again, but this time it was no longer just her husband's. It was the voice of the house itself, the voice of the secrets it kept. "You shouldn't have come." The darkness beyond the crack was deep and endless. And Evelyn, heart pounding with a mix of terror and determination, stepped forward. Chapter 10. The Unveiling. Evelyn's breath trembled as she stood at the edge of the cracked wall, her body drawn to the unseen force on the other side. The house whispered around her, its voice no longer confined to the air, but seeping into her very bones. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse in rhythm with the pounding in her chest, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, as though the cold was seeping in from another world. She reached forward, her fingers trembling, and touched the edge of the crack. The moment her skin made contact with the dark void, the room around her shuddered as if a great sigh passed through the very structure of the house. The wind, cold and unnatural, howled through the walls, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something far more ancient. Evelyn's heart beat faster as her hands, almost without her control, pulled further at the crack. The wallpaper peeled back, revealing not just the rotting wood and hollow spaces she had already uncovered, but something far deeper. The house was opening, as though it were alive, breathing, waiting. And then she saw it. The space beyond the crack was not empty. The shadows within it moved. Not just flickers of darkness, but forms, shapes of long-forgotten things, swirling like smoke, their outlines barely visible in the dim light of the room. A voice, soft but insistent, echoed again from the other side, its words carrying the weight of 1,000 years of secrets. "You should never have come back." It was the voice of the house. It was him, her husband's voice, but not as it had been before. It was altered, hollowed out by something ancient and bitter. The shadows behind the wall shifted again, and Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. There, just within reach of the crack, a figure began to emerge. His form was twisted, no longer the man she had loved, but a pale, ethereal version of him, his features distorted as though he were being drawn from another realm. Her heart lurched. "James?" she whispered, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and longing. "James, is it really you?" The figure's face, once so familiar, was now a mask of agony. His eyes were hollow, his skin stretched thin, as if the life had been drained from him, piece by piece. His lips moved, but his voice no longer held warmth. It was cold, distant, and filled with a terrible emptiness. "Evelyn, you don't understand. This house has taken me." His voice was a rasp, the words filled with a sorrow that made Evelyn's heart ache. "It feeds on what we leave behind. And now it wants you too." She reached out instinctively, but the space between them was widening, stretching further than she could reach. The figure of her husband, still reaching for her, began to melt into the shadows, his form becoming more and more translucent with every passing second. "Let go," he whispered, his voice becoming weaker, more distorted. "Let go, Evelyn. The truth is in the walls, in the silence. We're all trapped here. You can't escape. None of us can." The shadows behind him writhed, and Evelyn recoiled in fear, her chest tightening with dread. She took a step back, her mind reeling with what he had said. The house was not just a place, it was a prison, and it had claimed them all. The air in the room grew heavier, suffocating, as if the very house itself was closing in on her. Evelyn could feel the walls pressing in, the floor beneath her feet sinking into darkness. Her fingers clawed at the crack in the wall, but it was no use. The house had become a cage. With a sharp cry, Evelyn tore herself away from the wall, stumbling backward into the room. The darkness pressed closer, and she could feel her heart racing, the suffocating sense of being swallowed by the very house she had once loved. But something deep inside her, something primal, urged her to fight back. She turned toward the door. The hall outside was dark, but she could feel it. Freedom was out there, somewhere, just beyond the house's reach. The house wanted her. It wanted her to stay, to be its prisoner, to join the voices it had already claimed. But Evelyn couldn't allow it. She wouldn't. The house screamed as she ran toward the door, the walls buckling and groaning, as though the structure itself was alive, pulling at her, trying to drag her back. The whispers intensified, louder and more frantic, a chorus of lost souls and fading memories. Her hand grasped the doorknob, and for a moment it felt as if the house would rip her away from it, but she held firm, twisting the handle. The door opened with a deafening creak, and she stumbled into the hallway beyond. But as she crossed the threshold, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Evelyn," she turned, her heart breaking as she saw him, her husband's shadow, lingering in the doorway of the study. His face was twisted in anguish, but in his eyes there was something new, something unrecognizable. It wasn't him anymore. "Goodbye," the voice said, its tone now cold and final, before the door slammed shut with a resounding crash. Evelyn stood trembling in the hallway, her heart still pounding in her chest. The house had fallen silent. The whispering, the voices, the cold, it was all gone. She was alone. But the house, the thing that had once been her home, was no longer the same. It had taken everything from her, her husband, her peace, her sanity, but it had not taken her will. She had escaped. And yet, as she stood there, the weight of the house's grip still heavy on her shoulders, she knew one thing for certain. There were parts of the house that would always follow her. Some truths, she realized, were never meant to be unveiled. Some secrets were better left buried behind the wallpaper.